Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to explore a fascinating topic, comparing major forms of utilitarianism. We'll be focusing specifically on act, rule, and preference utilitarianism, diving into how each framework approaches ethical decision-making. The image you see here, a golden balance scale, symbolizes the pursuit of justice and fairness, which is at the heart of utilitarian thought. I'm excited to take you through these concepts and show how they shape moral reasoning in different ways. Let's get started. Here we have an introduction to utilitarianism, which is a moral theory focused on evaluating actions by their outcomes. The key idea is to maximize overall good, meaning that the right choice is the one that produces the greatest benefit for the most people. There are different variations within this theory, including act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, and preference utilitarianism. Each of these approaches offers a unique way of applying the principle, whether by looking at individual acts, general rules, or the preferences of those affected. This foundational understanding helps us grasp how utilitarianism guides ethical decision-making. Act utilitarianism is all about evaluating each action on its own merits, by looking at the specific consequences it produces. The fundamental idea is to choose the action that generates the greatest net happiness in that particular situation. What makes act utilitarianism unique is its focus on immediate consequences, which means every decision is assessed on a case-by-case basis rather than applying a fixed rule. This flexibility allows for considering the unique context of each circumstance to determine what will maximize overall well-being. So, in essence, act utilitarianism prioritizes the action that leads to the most positive outcome right then and there. Here we see a clear illustration of how act utilitarianism works to maximize overall good. The bar chart displays net happiness scores for 3 different actions. Action B stands out with the highest net happiness value of 30, indicating it produces the greatest positive impact. Action C follows with a net happiness of 20, and Action A has the lowest at 10. This visualization helps us understand that under act utilitarianism, the morally right choice is the one that results in the greatest net happiness, which in this case would be Action B. It clearly demonstrates the practical application of this ethical approach in evaluating outcomes to maximize overall well-being. When we look at ethical dilemmas in act utilitarianism, there are 3 key points to consider. First, the trolley-style sacrifice. This concept involves sacrificing one individual to save many, which can deeply conflict with our moral intuition about the rights of individuals. It raises questions about whether the ends truly justify the means. Second, breaking promises for net benefit highlights the tension between short-term gains and long-term trust. While violating trust might bring immediate advantages, it ultimately harms relationships and social cohesion over time. Finally, unpredictable long-term consequences remind us that actions maximizing immediate utility may lead to unforeseen negative outcomes in the future. These complexities show just how challenging it is to apply act utilitarianism consistently, especially when choices have ripple effects that are hard to foresee. Here, we're looking at rule utilitarianism, which focuses on following rules that are designed to create the greatest overall good when generally accepted and practiced. Instead of judging each individual action on its own consequences, this approach emphasizes the importance of consistency by relying on established rules that benefit everyone. This makes it different from act utilitarianism, where each action is evaluated separately. The key idea is that sticking to these beneficial rules leads to better outcomes in the long run. Here, the bar chart illustrates the aggregate outcomes based on different scenarios of rule adherence. As you can see, when the universal rule is followed consistently, the aggregate outcomes are the highest, reaching a value of 85. This highlights the positive impact of universally applying rules. In contrast, scenarios with frequent exceptions see a noticeable drop in outcomes to 60, indicating that flexibility in rules can decrease overall effectiveness. Finally, when no rules are followed at all, the outcomes fall even further to 40, demonstrating the challenges and negative consequences of rule absence. This data clearly supports the idea that rule utilitarianism, by emphasizing consistent rule following, maximizes overall good more effectively than the other scenarios. Here we're looking at some key ethical dilemmas in rule utilitarianism. First, under rule rigidity, we see that strictly following a rule without flexibility can actually cause harm in certain situations, which challenges whether the rule truly benefits everyone as intended. Moving to rule selection, there's the challenge of deciding which rules to implement. This requires carefully balancing their overall usefulness with the potential conflicts they may create in real-world scenarios. Finally, the exceptions problem highlights that if we make too many justified exceptions to rules, it can undermine the authority and effectiveness of those rules, essentially weakening the system that rule utilitarianism relies on. The stop sign image here nicely symbolizes the idea of rules and when it might be appropriate to pause or reconsider them. When we talk about preference utilitarianism, the main idea is that it prioritizes satisfying individual preferences or desires, not just focusing on happiness or pleasure. This means our well-being is measured by how well our specific preferences are met. Another important aspect is how it weighs these preferences. It recognizes that different preferences vary in intensity and type, so it takes into account how strong and what kind of preference it is, making sure each one is considered fairly based on its significance. This approach helps create a more nuanced and personalized understanding of well-being. Here we see how preference utilitarianism aims to maximize overall good by focusing on satisfying different types of preferences. The bar chart displays three categories: short-term preferences, long-term preferences, and informed preferences. Notice how aggregate preference satisfaction increases significantly from short-term to long-term and reaches its highest point with informed preferences. This highlights the importance of not just immediate desires, but also well-considered informed preferences when evaluating outcomes. In essence, the theory suggests that the best decisions are those that fulfill the most informed and deeply held preferences, thereby maximizing overall happiness or good. Here we explore some of the ethical dilemmas that arise within preference utilitarianism. First, conflicts between preferences present a major challenge. When people's desires clash, deciding which outcome best maximizes overall satisfaction can be tricky. Philosophers often debate whether priority rules or compromises provide fair solutions. Next, we consider harmful or uninformed preferences. Not all preferences are created equal. Some might cause harm or be based on misinformation, and this complicates how we weigh them impartially. Some argue that these preferences should have limited influence to prevent negative consequences. Finally, interpersonal preference aggregation addresses the difficulty of fairly combining different individual preferences into a collective decision. Approaches vary, from treating all preferences equally to making adjustments based on context, but a universally satisfactory method remains elusive. Together, these dilemmas highlight the complexity of ethically balancing diverse preferences in decision-making. Here we're comparing three main approaches to maximizing good from a utilitarian perspective. First, ACT utilitarianism looks at each individual action on a case-by-case basis, evaluating the consequences to choose the one that produces the greatest overall happiness. It's very flexible and focused on immediate outcomes. Next, rule utilitarianism takes a step back and considers general rules that, when followed consistently, tend to promote the best overall welfare. Instead of evaluating each act separately, it emphasizes the importance of following these beneficial rules. Finally, preference utilitarianism looks beyond just happiness and satisfaction, aggregating the fulfillment of individual desires while taking into account the different types or intensities of preferences people have. This approach weighs how various preferences are satisfied to determine what action or rule maximizes good. The icons here help visualize these distinctions. The chart for ACT utilitarianism reflects detailed analysis of individual cases. Bars for rule utilitarianism suggest stable guidelines, and the pie for preference utilitarianism represents the piecing together of diverse preferences. Together, these approaches offer different lenses through which we can understand and maximize well-being. Here we have three key examples illustrating how ACT utilitarians approach ethical dilemmas. First, consider the trolley sacrifice. ACT utilitarians would choose the action that maximizes immediate overall happiness, even if that means sacrificing one person to save many. This reflects their focus on outcomes rather than strict rules. Next, with broken promise, ACT utilitarians may decide to break a promise if it results in a greater net benefit overall, showing their flexibility when it comes to commitments. Lastly, in situations with conflicting preferences, ACT utilitarians weigh the immediate consequences carefully to fulfill the greatest welfare for the majority, even when different interests clash. These points highlight the pragmatic and consequence-driven nature of ACT utilitarianism in ethical decision-making. Here we explore the strengths and weaknesses of different forms of utilitarianism. Starting with ACT utilitarianism, its biggest advantage is flexibility. It allows us to make adaptable decisions tailored to specific situations, which is great for practical and nuanced moral judgment. Next, rule utilitarianism offers predictability and trust by establishing stable guidelines. These consistent moral rules help foster social trust because people know what to expect and can rely on shared principles. Finally, preference utilitarianism emphasizes respect for autonomous desires. It values individual choices and promotes respecting people's own preferences, highlighting the importance of personal autonomy. Each form has unique benefits that contribute to how we understand and apply utilitarian ethics. Here we look at practical examples of how different forms of utilitarianism apply in real-world scenarios. Starting with medical triage recommendations, ACT utilitarianism focuses on saving the most lives immediately, aiming for the greatest good in that moment. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, emphasizes following consistent guidelines to fairly allocate resources over time. Preference utilitarianism takes a more personalized approach, considering the wishes of patients and their families. Moving to public health policy, particularly vaccination, ACT utilitarianism supports mandates to achieve maximum immunization quickly. Rule utilitarianism promotes policies that build and maintain public trust in vaccines to ensure long-term compliance. Meanwhile, preference utilitarianism respects individual consent while still encouraging vaccination, balancing personal choice with community health. Lastly, in environmental regulation, ACT utilitarianism pushes for immediate pollution reduction to address urgent issues. Rule utilitarianism works by establishing sustainable standards that guide long-term environmental care. Preference utilitarianism strives to balance ecological concerns with the interests of local communities, trying to find a solution that respects multiple perspectives. These examples illustrate how each utilitarian approach shapes decisions across different important societal areas. When deciding between different forms of utilitarianism, it's important to weigh several key factors. First, consider how sensitive you need to be to the specific context of each situation. Next, think about how crucial it is to maintain consistent social rules that everyone follows. Finally, take into account the importance of respecting individual preferences and values. By balancing these elements thoughtfully, we can adopt a pluralistic approach that makes the application of utilitarian principles both practical and fair. This way, we ensure that our ethical decisions are well-rounded and responsive to real-world complexities. Now let's open the floor for questions and discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the trade-offs between the different utilitarian approaches we've covered. Think about which one seems most convincing in various situations and why that might be. How do these trade-offs actually impact the decisions we make in practice? Also, consider the real-world consequences. How might choosing one approach over another influence outcomes? Finally, are there any theoretical challenges or unresolved issues you think we should explore further? Feel free to share your perspectives.